Good morning. How are we doing this morning? Great. That was really strong. We are glad that you are here, and I'll say it like I do always, whether you're glad to be here or not, all right? We're glad that you are here. Thank you for joining us online as well. We're excited to finish our series this morning on King David. And this week I was reading about Oprah, right? Everyone in the room is familiar with Oprah. She had her TV show, I think, which ran for 25 years. And her worth after the TV show became about $2.6 billion. So she's worth a lot of money. And one thing I didn't know about Oprah is that she loves her dogs a lot. And I don't know if these dogs are still alive, if what I saw is old or new. But she has 5 dogs or had 5 dogs. And she set in place that if she dies before her dogs die, her dogs will receive an inheritance of $30 million. Okay, so her dogs are going to get $30 million, which is absolutely wild because her dogs have no idea the value of money, right? And so I thought that was fascinating that she wanted to make sure they were taken care of. So just a minimum $30 million should probably make sure that they have enough food to survive the rest of their life. What a legacy that would be, which should be part of her legacy, taking care of her dogs. Listen, the question that we want to wrestle with this morning is this: what do you want to outlast you? What do you want to outlast your life? You see, how do you want your life to actually be remembered? You see, when we think about leaving a lasting legacy, we have to process what we want to outlast the life that we actually have. And here's what's true for everybody is that we're all going to die, that we have a minimal amount of time here on earth, that God's already dictated what they'll actually be, and we actually don't know it. And so you have a timeline to create the legacy that you would desire to create. What do you want to pass on? What do you want to be known for? What do you want people to remember about who you are? And I'm sure most of you have received some kind of legacy from your parents or grandparents. Maybe the legacy that was left to you was related to some kind of possessions, or maybe it was involved money, or maybe it involved stories or memories or family values that have been passed on from generation to generation. Today we want to wrestle with what does King David want to actually leave behind. We're going to look at the last days of King David in 1 Kings. And if you were here last week, we unpacked the greatest failures in David's life. His adultery with Bathsheba, the covering up of murder when he killed Uriah, the consequences of that, of having the child that Bathsheba gave birth to actually killed. Here's the point. The sexual sin in David's life is rampant, but it also runs rampant through his own sons. If we would have continued the story in 2 Samuel, actually the next chapter after they learn of the death of their child, David and Bathsheba, we learn about David's oldest son, whose name's Amnon. And he actually rapes his half-sister, Tamar. And David's third oldest son, Absalom, hears about what the oldest son has actually done, and he goes to him and he kills him. And so think about the tension in David's family. Like, that's a lot of tension right there. And right after that, Absalom, the third oldest son, decides that he would like to be king, and he creates this huge conspiracy in all of Jerusalem, and people start following him and leaving behind King David. And the people start chanting, "Long live King Absalom." Absalom then decides to get on top of the palace roof, and he sets up a tent on the roof of the palace, and he chooses to have sex with every one of David's concubines. Why? So that all of Israel can hear him, and so he can be a stench to his father, the text says. He then has to try to win the throne through battle. And Absalom is on a horse, and he gets his head stuck in a tree, and he's hanging there. And they take 3 spears, and they drive him into his heart. And David then learns about the death of his third son, and David weeps. He's broken by the loss of his own son. We can move forward in the book of 2 Samuel. And we can see David has to fight the Philistines again. And what's wild about this last battle with the Philistines in 2 Samuel is that he has to fight descendants of Gath, which is where Goliath actually came from. And what's fascinating is another one of those people that he fights has the name Goliath. So there's 2 of them. in the scriptures. One of them has six toes on his feet, and one also has six fingers on his hands. So it's kind of wild what's actually happening there. But David is victorious over all the Philistines. He then writes a song to the Lord, I think in 2 Samuel 23. Where he declares his worship to the Lord because of how God has come through over every battle David has had to fight in his life. And so here's what we see then at the end of 2 Samuel, and that is this. If you know Jesus, if you know the Lord, your failures don't determine your legacy, but Jesus' victory determines everything. And if David's failures don't define his life, that's really good news for any sinner in the room this morning, that your failures don't have to define your life either. It's amazing. And so this morning we're going to see what's going to outlast David's life. But the question is that we need to wrestle with is what's going to outlast your life? We're going to make two observations out of 1 Kings chapter 2 this morning. And the first is this, is that what you're intentional about now creates your legacy. Let's look at verses 1 and 2 here in 1 Kings 2. It says, when David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I'm about to go the way of the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man. Well, here's what's true in the story. At this point, in 1 Kings 2, Solomon is now king. At the end of chapter 1, David chose Solomon to be king. The question is, why Solomon? Well, David's oldest son, Amnon, is dead. David's second oldest son, no one knows what happened to him. We believe that he's dead. The third oldest son, Absalom, had tried to take the throne, and he's dead. And the fourth oldest son is Adoniah. And so why is he not crowned king? He's next in line. He's the fourth son. He's currently the oldest son alive. Isn't he the one who should be chosen king? Let's flip back to chapter 1 and learn why he didn't get chosen. Look at what it says in verse 5 of chapter 1. Now Adonijah exalted himself, saying, I will be king. So here's David's fourth oldest son, declaring the same thing that the third oldest son, Absalom, decided, that I will be king. And we started the first week of this series wrestling with the same idea, and that is this. This is a choice we all have to make. Who will be king of your life? And the choice that you make actually determines the legacy that we create. And the legacy that we create is determined by who rules at the center of our lives. And here's what is happening here. We're seeing that there's two options in your life for your legacy. There's only two. It can be a you-centered legacy, or it can be a Christ-centered legacy. You-centered or Christ-centered. And so David is dying. He is old. His time is coming to an end. And what does this oldest alive son desire to do? It says he desires to exalt himself. Like he's almost saying, I'm giving myself the authority that I've decided I'm going to make myself king. Well, I wonder how that's going to go. You see, here's what he does. He then gathers a people around him. And there's something about us gathering a people that when it doesn't involve God's counsel, it always goes bad. We can see that over and over and over again in the scriptures. He gathers people around that will only say yes to him, that will never challenge him to help exalt him to the throne. I wonder if instead of exalting himself to the throne, if he maybe should have been spending time with his dad who's about to die. Like go hang out with your dad. Go spend time with him. He's about to die. You see, David's family is literally messed up. Look at what it says in verse 6 about Adonijah. It says, at the end, he was also a very handsome man, and he was born next after Absalom. By the way, is that not how King Saul was described? A very handsome man? Very handsome man. You see, I think how this is described here is this boy's he's a spoiled rich boy. Who's always been getting what he wants his whole entire life, and he's now hungry for power. And when people are hungry for power, they'll do whatever they have to do to actually take the throne. And there's something about God's anointed being on the throne that the world can't stand. And that is true right here with David, with his own son, who's his own blood. Look at what happens in verse 9, though. Adonijah, it says this, sacrificed sheep and oxen and fattened cattle by the serpent's stone. It then says he invited all his brothers, the king's sons, all the royal officials of Judah, but he did not invite Nathan the prophet, the mighty men, or Solomon his brother. Here's my question. Adonijah goes to make a sacrifice. And he sacrifices all sorts of stuff, all sorts of animals. What's up with the serpent stone? And I spent a lot of time trying to process the serpent stone this week. What does this actually mean? Where are they going to make this sacrifice? Your translation may say the Zolith stone, which literally means a slithering snake. Again, it's a biblical reference again to the idea of Satan. And this location of where this stone actually is at the southern tip of the valley of Hinnom, which is significant in the Bible, which was just outside Jerusalem. I've been there before. I've overlooked this valley, and it was a place historically where idol worship has taken place along with child sacrifices. It was often known as the Valley of Slaughter, the place where they would burn children and then burn garbage, and it produced a strong sewer stench all around Jerusalem. It's a terrible place, actually. It's often described as a place as a garbage heap. The flame never actually went out. Something was always burning in this place, which we then get to the New Testament, and it's a reference to the reality of hell, where Jesus talks about hell being a place where the worm will go, but the fire will never stop. Like, that's how this place is described, biblically speaking. It's a place of witchcraft. It's often tied to the god of Molech, who was the leader of the Canaanite deities historically. And Molech's root name literally means to be king or to rule. And so we see where Adonijah is turning to get permission or to get authority to be crowned king. He gets these people to come with them, and they come to this place where it's really a worship of Satan. It's a terrible place to be. He represents the evil one. He stands in opposition not just to God's anointed King David, but he stands in opposition to God himself. And just like Satan, he's hungry for power. He wants to be exalted because he wants to be worshiped. And just like Satan, he attempts to take what is not rightfully his, and it goes bad for him. You see, at the end of chapter 1, Solomon's chosen as king because of this. And then later in 1 Kings, King Solomon has to kill his own brother for attempting to take his throne. And so think about the hatred, the bloodshed, the sin involved with David's own sons. And we get back to chapter 2. Let's look at the verses again with me. It says, when David's time to draw near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I'm about to go the way of the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways, keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. And so Solomon, remember, he's way down the list of next up to receive the throne, to receive the crown, but he is chosen as king. And we see this reality, that the powers of man can't overtake God's promises. And David says this to Solomon, I'm about to die. And then what we see here is David's last words to his son. Here's the question. If you knew that you could have one more conversation with your kids, one more chance, one conversation, what do you want them to know? Because David here, he's incredibly intentional. Everything here is actually on purpose. And he challenges Solomon. What does he say? He says, be strong and show yourself a man. Literally, David is saying, hey, Solomon, do your job. Be a man. Well, what is a man? That's the question that we need to have answered in our world today. That's a confusing question, actually, in the culture we're in right now. What is a man? Well, humanly speaking, in the life of David, we've seen, well, good men are tall, they're handsome, they're ripped, they're good warriors, they're hard workers, they have amazing sexual conquest, they're fighters. Listen, this is not how David actually defines manhood. He gives 3 verbs that stick out to me. It's the word keep, the word walk, and the word prosper. Keep, walk, and prosper. Keep the charge of the Lord. Walk in his ways, that you may prosper in all that you do. It's almost like God is saying this. Obedience to God's word creates a man after God's heart. Do you realize that David just gave Solomon the blueprint for a Christ-centered legacy? You see, if you want a Christ-centered legacy, it has to be about the things that Jesus is actually about. And the beautiful thing we see in Solomon's life is this, is that Solomon is king because God redeems sinners. And we can learn by looking at David's life that even when your walk with God is in a bad spot, listen, God is still faithful to you. And in David's life, we learn that when you walk with God, your sin doesn't actually outlast you, but God's blessing outlasts you. In 2015, Redemption Church was planted. And I moved up here from Raleigh, North Carolina. Matt Thompson moved from Arizona. Pastor Steve moved over from Muskegon. We had no money, and we just totally stepped out in faith and lived with our parents to make it happen, all right, and trusting in the Lord and His Spirit. Here's what we did, though. We did demographic research on Huntsville, Jenison, and Granville, and we found that 66.9% of people in Huntsville, Jenison, and Granville are de-churched or unchurched. 66.9%. So get us all on the same page. De-church means someone who grew up in the church but is no longer attending church. I'm sure you know many of them. Unchurched would be someone who's never really been a part of church in their life. So here's what happens. We have people that grow up in the church, they become de-churched where they decide this is no longer for me. They then get married and have kids, and their kids are now unchurched people. And that's how the generations are starting to flow out of here, out of Huntsville, Jenison, and Granville. Here's the point. When I look at the amount of people that live in our cities here, right here, Huntsville, Jenison, and Granville, with the amount of churches that we actually have, with Baldwin Street at one point being the Guinness Book of World Records for most churches on a street, there's tons of churches, and there's a growing community. What's the problem? Listen, we haven't left very good legacies for our children. That's the problem. Men are not being men. Men are staying boys. They're not keeping. They're not walking. They're not prospering in the way that God would want them to prosper because they're not bringing God into their sphere of heart of what they should be about, what they should be doing in their life. Do you want to leave a Christ-centered legacy? Because if so, you can put a dent in the 66.9% that exist in our city right now that are on their way to hell, by the way. The legacy that you desire to leave is going to be defined by what you worship. Wherever you find your worth is going to determine your legacy. That's going to be the guiding force of everything that your life is about. And here's what's true. You get two choices, you-centered or Christ-centered. That's it, you or Christ. And if it's you, which you can do that, go ahead and do that. Most people choose that, so it wouldn't be abnormal. It would actually be normal. So go ahead, you have permission. Choose to make it about you, but when you make it about you, what comes with that is all the lows and the highs of your life. It's not just the highs. It's just not the good times. It's the sin. It's the bad. It's the ugly. Those things will define your legacy. But if Christ is your legacy, it's defined by the redeeming power of the resurrection. You see, you can build your legacy on all your wins in your life, all the great business deals you've made, all the great money you can leave behind. But when you do that, you also have to build your legacy based off the losses in your life. Or you can choose to leave a legacy based on Christ's victory. The choice is yours. Listen, in David's last conversation, recorded conversation with his son, what could have David talked about? I mean, what have we seen David do in this series? He could have talked about, how about this? How about politics? That's not a hot topic in our time at all, but here in the Bible time, he could have talked about the political climate of Israel and Jerusalem and all that's happening there. He could have talked about leadership ideas. He could have talked about his greatest victories as a warrior, defeating Goliath. He could have given Solomon Goliath's sword off the mantle. He could have talked about all the sexual conquest in his own life that David had. He could have talked about government issues. Listen, a you-centered legacy only leaves people the opportunity to be impressed by you. And David knew this. The legacy that he wanted to leave behind had nothing to do with the crown, had nothing to do with the throne, and had nothing to do with his accomplishments and everything to do with God's faithfulness in his life. And here's what's true. What you love will outlast your life, and what you leave behind is going to be based on what you actually love. And every one of us is going to leave behind something. It's not a choice if you're going to leave behind something. The choice is what you're going to leave behind. Have you considered that? What you want your life to be about? What do you want to outlast your life? What you're intentional about now matters. Here's the second thing we'll see, that who you influence now will carry on your legacy. Look at verse 3 with me. And keep the charge of the Lord, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, his testimonies, as is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart, with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. And so David is laying out for Solomon the plan to prosper, the plan to succeed in life. Well, I guess the question is, how has David prospered? When we read about his family, it's a disaster. Listen, let the brokenness of David's family actually give you hope that it's never too late to leave the kind of legacy that you want to leave behind. Our legacy right now is determined by what we're intentional about now. It's also determined about who we influence right now. And so David is an old, beaten down man. He probably has many battle wounds in his life. He's experienced the terrible pain of outliving most of his sons. Terrible pain. Is it possible that David's life could be full of regret? Do you think if you were in David's shoes that his life would have heavy guilt? Do you think it's possible that David wished he ever would have been a better husband or a better father? You see, do you think David ever battled depression? Look at all the mistakes I've made. Look at all the pain I've caused. Do you think David ever had terrible anxiety? You see, we go to Psalms and we can see David as he's like a spiritual schizophrenic, right? Like one day he's on cloud 9 with God. Like he's just loving the Lord as the deer pants for the water. My soul thirsts for you, God. And then the next day it's like, where are you? You're nowhere near to be found. Where are you, God? He's all over the place. Why do I see myself in him so clearly? You see, it should give us hope that no matter your past today, a Christ legacy is still possible. Why? Because a Christ legacy actually elevates Jesus to the forefront. And what happens when you elevate him is that your life begins to change. And what you leave behind is not the mistakes you made, but the one who's actually changed your life. It's him. And here's the point. You see, I think the greatness of David's sin is no match for the greatness of David's God. Look at the pain of David's story. We've just reviewed some of it. None of that defines him. What defines him is the greatness of the Lord and who's working in his life. So what you're intentional about now matters. Who you influence now actually matters. And so it's important to be able to get that right. I think often about what my kids get as a dad. I think there's been many times where we've been able to influence, me specifically, I've been able to influence my kids towards Jesus. But there's also many times where my kids don't get the Jesus-centered dad. They get the sinful, me-focused dad. And for some reason, that just doesn't go well. So I've been a parent for 3 years, maybe, with our 7, 6, and 5-year-old. And there's been so many great wins, and there's been so many great failures. Ever been there? One thing I love to figure out is what's the theology that they're developing in their hearts and their lives. And one way I love to tell what they know and what they're learning is how they pray. And our youngest is 5. He was born deaf. He got cochlear implants at 2.5 years old, so he's been hearing for 2.5 years. And a few months ago at dinner, we asked Johnny to pray, little Johnny. And Johnny says this. He says, I want to thank you, Satan, for dying on the cross. So I open my eyes, I look across the table at my wife, and I say, this is not on me. This has got to be you. I've never talked about Satan being the one that died on the cross. Well, a few weeks ago, he prayed again, and he prayed this: I want to thank you, Jesus, for dying on the cross a few times. Okay, so here's what we're seeing. We're seeing theological growth in our 5-year-old, right, who's just learning to talk. All right? And so here's what's important. Growth's important. Now listen, please don't go home and tweet that the pastor of Redemption Church's son prays to Satan. Okay? Because that's really not the plan in our home. But that's what's been happening in this season. right? He's in a spot where he's learning and he's growing, and we're in a spot where the legacy that we want to leave behind for him, what we want him to know, what we want to outlast us is that he knows the person of Jesus. Look what it says in verse 4 again. David says this, that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, concerning David. If your sons pay close attention to the way, to walk with him in faithfulness, with their heart and all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. You see, David is referencing, I believe, the covenant that God actually made with him. You see, when your legacy is Christ-centered, who you influence around you is incredibly important, and what you get to do, and what David is doing here is he's having specific conversation with his son, saying this, listen, son, in the face of my failure, God has been incredibly faithful to me. Hey, Solomon, in my failures as your dad, and it's my failures to your mom, listen, please know that God has been incredibly faithful to me. And so the pain that David has caused is so huge in David's life. But yet, what is he doing now? He's declaring God's faithfulness to him. You see, his life is defined by the promises of God, by God's presence in his life. And so, Solomon, please understand that in the face of my greatest mistakes, failures, and sins, God is with me. He's still been present. He's still faithful, and he will be the same for you. And in 2 Samuel chapter 7, we can see what God said when he set up the covenant with David. And it says this, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will rise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom, and he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. And when he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before you. Listen, did you catch that? That's the covenant that God made with David. Here's the guarantee. The guarantee is this, is that blessing is going to come from God. That the blessing you receive from God is actually tied to the faithfulness of God in our lives. And here's what David is saying. Listen, hey, Solomon, God's been incredibly faithful to me, even through my poor choices, and he will do the same for you if you're faithful to him. And if we turn to the book of Proverbs in the Bible, we can look at the first 7, 8, 9, 10 chapters of it, I'm going to guess. And what we see is King Solomon actually having a conversation with his son. So exactly what David is doing in 1 Kings chapter 2, where he's having a relationship to communicate what matters most, we can turn to Proverbs and we can see Solomon saying some very similar things, even thoughts about what kind of woman you should look to marry. Specific conversations that Solomon has. Solomon also gets to build the temple, which God highlighted in the covenant, where God's people could gather to worship the Lord. But here's the downfall for Solomon. Just like his daddy, he loved women. And we can read about it in the next couple chapters in 1 Kings. Solomon has 700 wives and 300 concubines. And it goes on to tell us that Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And God references what you've been practicing. God says, what you've been practicing is far from me. And it literally says that God showed up to Solomon twice, 2 times. He showed up to Solomon. And Solomon is still saying, I'm going to do something differently. I'm going to pursue everything the world has to offer. You see, here's Solomon who asked for wisdom from the Lord, and God made him the wisest man to ever live. He had ridiculous wealth because of his wisdom. He had unbelievable possessions because of his wisdom. He tried everything the world had to offer to find happiness outside of God. And in 1 Kings 11, it says that he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not follow God. He turned his heart from the Lord. But guess what? What did God say in the promise to David in 2 Samuel 7? My steadfast love will never depart from him. Listen, you again can take incredible confidence in light of all that God knows to be true of you. He loves you desperately. He loves you. And so I can't help but think that what if legacy is not something we leave behind for others, but it's something that we leave in others. And if that's actually true, that means every decision you make right now really matters. And that in verse 4, he literally says, pay attention to their way. Like, hey, if your sons pay close attention to their way, if they pay close attention to the Lord, if they do what they're supposed to do, things are going to work out. You see, so often we have this belief in West Michigan that we need to get our life cleaned up before we come to God. The problem is God wants the broken version of you. He wants the messed up, broken version of you. And so don't try to clean yourself up to then start working on your legacy. Come to the Lord as you are, right in the position you find yourself in, whether it's a good day or a bad day, or you're close to the Lord or you're running away from the Lord. He wants you as you are, and let him do the work in your heart and in your life. Don't wait until you're a better spot. There's no better spot to be to come along the spot you're in right now. When I think about legacies, I often think about gravestones and epitaphs, which are statements that are written on the gravestone that define or speak to the contribution of that person's life. And I saw some terrible examples online this week. One lady, literally what was on her gravestone was her fudge recipe. Like that was her contribution to life, that she made good fudge. Like that's it? That's all your family could actually say about you? Another example was an example of a man who was only known by his political party and his hatred of the other one. I wonder if that one did anything for his eternal value. Another person, he was actually a murderer, and on his gravestone it said he never murdered a man who didn't have it coming. Like that's how his life is described. Listen, I believe that the greatest legacies are not written on gravestones, they're written on hearts. Real people that have interacted with you. And you can think about all the influence that you can have in your life with everybody around you. All of that adds up. And whatever legacy you're going to leave is going to be tied to who you're influencing in the moment. Look at verse 10 through 12 as we see David die. It says that David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. In the time that David reigned over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron, 33 years in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of David, his father. And what does it say? That his kingdom was firmly established. Listen, there is no greater legacy to share than the legacy that highlights God's faithfulness in your life. And if I give you one gospel takeaway, I would say it this way, that the legacy that we leave points to the greatest legacy that we've received. Think about that for a minute. What could define David's legacy? We could talk about the sins, the sexual sin, the lust, the rape, the greed, the murder, the selfishness. In fact, at the end of 2 Samuel, there's some stunning things that actually take place. You see, David sins against God again at the end of 2 Samuel, the last chapter. And God says, hey, David, I'm sending one of three punishments your way. One of three consequences. You can decide which of the three you want it to be. And what does David do? David throws himself down on the mercy of God, and he says, you decide. I'm going to trust in your mercy. And here's what God does. God says an angel, and the angel literally carries out a pestilence in the land, and 70,000 people die because of a decision that David actually made. And it says this in 2 Samuel 24. I want you to see this with your own eyes. It says in verse 16, and when the angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord relented from the calamity and said to the angel who was working destruction among the people, it is enough. Now stay your hand. Are you catching what's happening in this text? The angel's literally stretching out his hand to destroy Jerusalem. Literally, God was going to end his promises. Literally, God's unconditional faithfulness was about to become conditional. God was going to be done. God was tired of all of his people running away from his goodness. The covenant he made with David would be over. The salvation for you would never have been able to happen if God destroys the city of Jerusalem. It's all done. He's like, I'm out here. But what did God actually do? It says that he relented. He relented. Listen, please know, when God relents of his wrath, his character still demands justice. And when he chose to relent of his wrath, what is he doing? He chose to store up his wrath. But here's the problem. God can't store up his wrath forever. He can't do it. His character demands justice. And so I guess the question is, why didn't God pour out his wrath on David in his life for the mess of a man that he absolutely was? Why? You see, God chose to store his wrath, to keep it from David and give David grace. But guess what he did? He had to dump it somewhere, and he dumped it on his son Jesus at the cross. So I guess the question is, why didn't God pour his wrath on you for all of your sin and all of your brokenness and all of your wickedness in your own heart? Well, all the ways you want to elevate yourself, like, why didn't God pour it out on you? Listen, God stored up all of his wrath, and the good news for us is Jesus has already died. He already received all the wrath of God, all the wrath that we should have deserved actually went upon him. You see, the legacy that Jesus leaves is not defined by what the world loves. It's defined by what the world needs. And we know that Jesus, he had no wife. He had no children. He left no possessions. He left no house, no money, no business. Instead, what did he leave behind? He left boundless compassion of his blood. That dictates your legacy. You see, God stored up his wrath, and then he dumped it out on his own son in your place. Please know what that means. That literally means that God's wrath for you is eternally satisfied in Jesus. Past, present, future sin, it's the same. God's wrath for you is eternally satisfied in Jesus. Are you blown away by God's faithfulness to you? Are you blown away that his faithfulness to you has no conditions? He's such a good God. Listen, never forget the legacy that Jesus is leaving you. Never forget it. And we could turn to Matthew chapter 1, and we could look at the legacy of Jesus, and guess who you're going to find in there? You're going to find King David, and it literally says, the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba. And you're going to find Solomon in there. And you're going to find a whole slew of other sinners in that list that all come to the point of Jesus. But guess what? Jesus died on the cross and he had his blood shed. And so guess what that means? His legacy actually continues to anyone who has a personal relationship with him. And so by his blood, you are brought in, and the legacy of Jesus continues, and we are actually grafted into that legacy, which then means, right, that everything's been intentional by the Lord. He identifies himself with sinners. Crazy. You've been bought by his blood. So what intentional steps must you take to have a Christ-centered legacy? Listen, if you did nothing intentional the rest of your life, what would your legacy be? If you did nothing with influence the rest of your life, what would your legacy actually be? In 20 years, if nothing changes in your life, what will your legacy be? Listen, we have an awesome opportunity not to base our legacy on what we can accomplish and bring to the table, but we have an opportunity to base our legacy on what Jesus Christ has accomplished on our behalf. And so think about where God has placed you in this world. God has given you your spouse that you have, your children. Like he picked you for that spouse, and he picked you for those kids, and he picked you for that job in whatever season you have it, and he picked you for the neighbors that you have on purpose. Like everything was intentional by the Lord. Why? So that his people who've been redeemed by his blood can influence people in a specific way where they too can come to know the life-changing message of the gospel and be grafted in to the legacy of Jesus Christ. He's given you a role. He's given you responsibility. Hey, men, it's time to be men. It's time to keep the word. It's time to walk with the Lord and watch him prosper. And the prosper may not be money, but it'll be blessings that money can't actually buy. I promise you that. And so what if we stepped up and had an opportunity to leave a gospel-centered legacy that could literally put a huge dent in the 66.9% that are going to hell in our city because they don't know the gospel. They've heard moralism. They've heard be a good boy instead of understanding that they're sinners and Jesus is good. We have an opportunity, friends, to leave a gospel legacy, not just for your family, but for our city. And so let's pray. Jesus, I want to thank you for the gospel. I want to thank you for good news that you love sinners. I want to thank you, Lord, for the legacy that you've left behind, for the blood that was shed that wasn't mine but was yours. Lord, I can see myself in David in so many ways. Yet, in David's life, you described him as a man after your own heart. May that be true of the men and women of Redemption Church, that we are described by you as people who are so in tune with you that we're using and living our life in a way to make much of you. Lord, it's been a rough season, but hope is found in you. And so I pray the legacy that we carry out, we can start thinking about it now, will be based on intentionality and will be based on influence. We love you, Jesus. In your name, amen.